A very good afternoon, everybody, and the participants to the next session. With me today is Mr. Andre Jooste. He is an ultrasound specialist from Acumen eSolutions. He's very intrigued and enthusiastic about ultrasound, and he will be particularly speaking about using structure-borne ultrasound to prevent incorrect lubrication of critical bearings. So, as someone active in the lubrication industry, very interested to hear what he has to say. So without further ado, I'll welcome Andre to the floor. For the participants, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat box on the right side of your screen. Andre, please take it away. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much. I hope people can hear me well. The sound seems to be coming through, but touch and go. So I'm going to start sharing the screen. Let's see if this works. See if I can get there. Can you all see that?
You have to put it in presenter mode. You can see the full screen.
Can you see this, Lars? Can you see the screen?
I can see the screen. I'm seeing the whole PowerPoint. So if you want to show slide by slide, I think you have to activate the slideshow.
I seem to have lost complete sound. Can somebody just go on the messages and tell me if you can hear me and if you can see the screen?
If you can hear me, Andre, I can hear you. But I think you have to share your screen again. So I think what you did the first time was right. So if you can stop sharing your screen and reshare the way you did the first time.
Try that, and share. Can you see it now?
A few seconds. No, not yet.
Well, there it is.
Yes.
If we can't get it better than this.
Yes, at least we can see the slides. So,
can you see the screen now?
Yeah.
All right. So I might just have to go back and do it the old-fashioned way like this. All right. So first of all, thank you very much for your time. We're talking about using industrial ultrasound to help lubrication. Now, just the 2-second update on ultrasound. Ultrasound works at 20,000 hertz or higher. We sort of work between 20,000 hertz and 40,000 hertz. Human hearing, just for the record, is around about 16,500 hertz. So it's way above human hearing. And ultrasound picks up very effectively turbulence or friction. turbulence to the extent that if you have an air leak that takes a foam bubble 45 minutes to form, ultrasound will hear it. We also can listen to, very successfully listen to friction, and the friction that we're listening to we normally describe it as decibel readings. So every bearing, when it runs, has its own natural decibel level that it runs at. It could be anything from 0 up to, I don't know, about 30, 40 decibels. So in ultrasound, when the decibel level increases from the standard level by 8 decibels, we normally know it needs grease. When it increases by 16 decibels, we know there's probably some structural damage, microscopic damage. And when it increases by 35 decibels, we know there's real structural damage. So based on this information, we can now start tracking bearings and start seeing how they track using the ultrasound. Now, when we look at bearings itself, people who probably know more about bearings than most other people are SKF. And SKF came back and said that roughly 80% of all bearing failures are attributed to incorrect or to some extent to lubrication. And it could be either that the bearing has got too much or too little lubrication, that it has incorrect lubrication, that it has contaminated lubrication, or that it has, or the lubrication is getting too old and it hasn't been updated enough. So 80% of bearing failures, according to SKF, we can actually manage and try and stop by using ultrasound to make sure that we don't have these problems. So the first point that SKF raises is insufficient lubrication. Now, we normally, in the old days, we used to believe the problem was under lubricating bearings. So if the bearing starts running dry and you don't put grease in there, it fails. We also now have learned that as many bearings gets destroyed by over lubrication as under lubrication, and the reason for that is if there's too much grease in the bearing, it creates friction. Friction creates heat. Heat creates expansion. Expansion creates more friction, and it's just circle. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And as the grease expands due to the heat, the only place it can go is can either pop the seal, or the grease can get packed so tightly that the rollers or the balls stop turning, and then instead of the ball turning, sucking grease in as part of its normal running, it will start operating like a blade and starts pushing grease out the way, and then all of a sudden you're dealing with metal on metal contact. So I just want to play two sounds of bearings, if you can hear this. This is a bearing in a good condition. You will hear it's just a nice smooth sound. And this is what a bearing sounds like that's in a bad condition. So in this bearing, there's quite a lot of friction and it's damage on the inside. So from an ultrasound point of view, it is really easy to work out and see what's going on in bearings. This particular slide that I'd like to show you is actually a slide that says in this slide we have A and a B level. A was where the bearing needs grease and it's quite dry and it's quite noisy. B is the point where you see the big dip. That's the point where the grease goes into the bearing. And I'll just play you this sound file. You will hear twa, 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 twa. The guy's using an electric grease gun to put the grease in, and you will hear the big difference immediately. As you can hear, there's a big difference between the bearing needing grease and the bearing receiving the correct amount of grease. This is just a time waveform, ultrasound time waveform file of a bearing that needed grease, but after it was given grease, it still has some internal structural friction or damage on the inside. So you'll see the grease did make a big drop, but there's still spikes after the grease, and that's because the bearing itself has some structural problems. And these two files are files where people greased the bearing, And then instead of stopping at the point where the grease were correctly greased, they kept on adding grease. So you'll see that the friction inside the bearing just keeps on increasing and gets worse and worse. The second slide, the one on your right-hand side, that one, the bearing was correctly greased, and then people added unnecessary grease, and all of a sudden you can see the bearing is now significantly more stressed on the inside. So these are just some examples on how we use the ultrasound to determine whether a bearing needs grease or not. So I'll play you, here's another sound recording of a bearing getting correctly greased. And in this one, they're using a hand grease gun, so the change is slightly more gradual. So you hear the bearing is quite quiet now after the greasing. In this example, which is the one on your right-hand side, that's the one where the bearing was greased. It was adequately greased, but the guys kept on adding grease, and you start seeing the friction inside the bearing rebuilding again. You can hear the bearing is nice and quiet now, but they keep on adding grease. And you can clearly hear that the bearing is now getting more and more under stress as it's getting more and more grease added to it, and the friction on the inside increases. So in the old days we used to do greasing. So the classical manual greasing, just a basic grease gun. Now I didn't list too many advantages there, because technically the advantage obviously is that you're adding grease. But the disadvantages is you can have lubricant contamination. Remember, grease nipple on the outside, as soon as you put a grease gun on top of it, if that grease nipple is not 100% cleaned, it will introduce the contaminants inside it'll force the contaminants inside the bearing, and that'll have a problem. You can have incorrect lubricants on there. So if you have a different types of lubricants, like a aluminum complex to a bentonite grease, they will destroy each other, and that'll be bad for the bearings. If you have a long time, there's no record of how often you grease, so you can forget to grease the bearing, and it can be a long time. And you can also, of course, add insufficient quantities, either over greasing or under greasing with a grease gun. So what the guys then did is they said, let's build the classic electrolubers. So electroluber is just basically an electrical or battery operated piece of equipment, and what it does is you screw it onto the grease gun, you set a timing switch, and it'll pump grease into the bearing in regular intervals, which basically says that you have regular greasing. You no longer have the risk of contamination by putting on a new grease nipple on a grease gun on the nipple every time, and you have less of a chance putting the wrong grease in there because it's fixed. But again, quantity control is still an issue. You can still either overgrease or undergrease, and that's still one of the big issues that destroy bearings often from time to time. So the people then said, right, let's add a ultrasound gun to the grease gun. This one we can absolutely make sure that we add the correct quantity of grease, like the slides I've just played earlier. So you can be absolutely sure you get the correct quantity of grease. You can make sure that you don't unnecessarily grease, because you can listen to the bearing before you grease. And if the bearing doesn't need grease, my advice to people always is don't grease. But it still has the disadvantages that every time you put the grease gun on there, you can bring contamination in. And of course, you can always put the incorrect grease in there because it depends on what's on the grease gun. So the latest thinking, and this is what I want to talk about, is the one that says the new generation of ultrasound is we take an ultrasound system, we add it to an electroluber, and the combination of the two says we will now have regular greasing, we will stop contamination going into the nipples, we will stop incorrect grease types going in, and we'll make sure that we only put the correct type of grease into the bearing. And how that will work is as follows. So you take, that's just basically the system. So the first thing you do is you take an ultrasound sensor, the one over there, and you add it onto the bearing permanently. It's permanently fixed as per the photograph there. So that's just a ultrasound sensor fixed onto a bearing. It's there permanent 24/7, and it would read the information and feedback to the box, which is the red on-truck box over there. The box can take 16 channels, so you can have 16 sets of bearings that you can monitor at any point in time. The box will do 24/7 monitoring. It will then send the information to your computer, either by Bluetooth or wireless or LAN systems to your computer. And on the computer, you can then analyze the bearing, and the system will notify you if the bearing needs grease. So if the decibel levels change by 8 decibel, as we said right in the beginning, once you go over 8 decibel change, the system will either send you an email or a text and shows you a little screen that says there's a problem. You then have an electroluber which is fixed on the grease nipple, and the system will then tell the electroluber to add in grease. And what it does is it adds little bits of grease over a period of about 20 minutes. So it keeps on adding a little bit, and takes feedback to ensure that when it adds the grease, it's absolutely 100% and there's no over grease or under grease. This is just what the dashboard will look like. The 33 on the corner, the left top corner, that's the current decibel level that the bearing is running at. The little screen next to it, green, yellow, and red, is just basically a little screen that tells you as long as it's within the green, it's perfectly greased. When it goes into yellow, it means it needs grease, and when it goes into red, it means the bearing has got an issue. The little block next to it is the two buttons that you use to add the grease into the bearing. So once the unit tells you that it needs grease, you hit one of those two buttons, and the one button is you ask the system to automatically grease, so the system will work out itself when to grease it. The second button is just if you want to keep control and you want to do a manual grease. The blue little button on the side is just a little graph that tells you how much grease is still in your electroluber, so you don't run out of grease. The graph underneath the 33 is just basically a visual graph to see how the decibel readings of the bearing would change. The row of numbers under that is just time date stamp of the decibel readings, and you can set that up for whatever you want. So you can go back over time and see how the dB levels changed. Then the very last block on the right-hand side basically tells you the amount of grease that it's put in. It gives you the time date stamp, and you can go back in previous records and see what you can do in terms of how the grease was added into the bearing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, instead of going back there and trying to monitor bearings like we always used to do, we're now going to be back in there, and we're going to start managing the bearing to make sure we never have an issue that it's either greased or under greased. We know if the bearings are always correctly greased, never too much, never too little grease. Those bearings should last quite long, and people often ask me, how long should a bearing last? And my understanding is, if you have a correctly spec'd bearing, a good quality one, you have the correct size, you have the correct lubricants in there, then you should never have any metal on metal contact, and then that bearing should actually outlast the equipment you put it in. But we seldom see that happening, and that's because of all these things, bringing contamination, having incorrect levels of grease in there, and things like that. So the system joining up And I don't sell either of those. I do not sell the ultrasound equipment. I don't sell the electrolubers. But if you can join up the two technologies of electrolubers and ultrasound, you can develop a system that says we can go into future and make sure that our bearings are always properly greased, and that we don't grease them unless they need to. Yeah, that's basically what we're trying to do with the system. So I would like to open up for questions. So if anybody has any questions, I hope I can hear you. If I can't hear you, I'd appreciate it if we can just go and use the little question box.
That was a great presentation, Andre. I hope you can hear me and see me. So I haven't seen any questions in the question box. The attendees are not able to use their microphone. So we'll give them some time to think of questions that they want to ask you. In the meantime, if you can hear me, Andre, I have a question for you. What do you see as the average cost at a company of using incorrect lubrication of greases?
Sorry, Elsa, it breaks up quite badly, so I didn't hear your question. If you can please just either repeat it or send it to me in the question box.
So my question was, what do you think is the average cost of incorrect lubricating of greases or of bearings that you see at companies? Or maybe you can give us like an extreme example of the cost that it can do to a company and the average example.
Are you asking about
No,
the
I'm
cost
asking
of the
about the
ultrasound
cost
systems?
of incorrect lubrication of grease on average. I'll put it in.
Well, the cost of incorrect lubrication is roughly about 20, according to SKF, is about 25% of all bearing failures. So if you can calculate what is 25% of all bearing failures, that'll be the cost of incorrect lubrication. And add to that the cost of the full 80%, which is the bearing incorrect lubrication, too much, too little, incorrect lubrication, contamination in lubrication, and then you get 80% of all bearing failures, and 80% of bearing failures would run into billions of dollars in the industry.
That's actually great. It's astonishing. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, if we talk about 80% of bearing failures, the causes thereof, then we should all sit up and take serious.
Do you see that happening, Andre? Do you see companies becoming more aware and doing more investment? Do you see this evolving in the good side, or not as much as you would like?
Well, I have the real fortune to have some major clients as companies as clients, and some small companies. I still come across people who run to failure mode. And they say, you know, if this bearing could have run another 3 weeks, we replaced it today. It's 3 weeks too early. We could save some money. Now you can only do that if your operation is tiny, and if you don't have critical equipment. I mean, some of the power stations that I work with, if they want to run to failure, the whole country will stop. So they can't do that. So I find companies who have critical equipment. I find companies. The sort of blue chip companies who have massive turnover, they are taking some really spectacular steps to prevent bearing failures because they've worked out the cost of that. So my advice also to people is you never want to do your whole plant. You need to identify critical equipment, and you need to find equipment that will cost you really big money if it goes down, and that's where you need to focus on. If a small little backup pump has a bearing failure, mostly people don't worry about it because there's a second pump it can run. But if your main extruder stops working, you have a problem, and that's where we need to focus.
I'm actually writing some things down because it's related to my industry as well. In terms of innovations, Andre, do you see anything down the line on the horizon maybe in the general industry of bearing and lubrication, or maybe related to ultrasound, How do you see that landscape in the future?
Well, put it this way: the US Systems, the American company who started this technology, have actually stopped supplying people because the demand is so high. They physically cannot keep up with the demand. So, as the technologies, the innovation increases, people are really buying into it because they're beginning to understand how much money they can save. If you have a big plant and your turnover is X million a month, and I can guarantee you that 80% of your failures will stop overnight. People grab it with both hands and they really go for it. So this is one innovation. I understand that there are new innovations in the pipeline. And so my view is probably next year when we have this conference, there will be new innovations
Great,
we can talk about.
We have two questions in the question box, Andre. One that I have here is, what is the normal sound level of a new bearing, or do you have to do a baseline reading to determine that?
Every single bearing has got its own baseline. So bearings can be anything from 0 dB if it's a really small, slow-moving bearing, to about 35 dB as a baseline. So what we normally do is we always take the baseline reading, which in a perfect world is when the bearing is brand new. Alternatively, if you can't do that, you make sure the bearing is properly greased, and you take that as the baseline reading. And bearing baseline readings can also change over time. As the bearing gets older, as the load gets harder, as the temperatures change, the dB levels can change. So you can't really say you can't really predict a bearing's dB level, but you have to take it a baseline level when the bearing is in good condition and properly greased, and start working from there. So sometimes you find two bearings that look identical have different dB readings because the one is closer to a heat source than the other one, or the one is a drive-in bearing and the other one is a non-drive-in bearing. So the drive-in bearing works a little bit harder. And those things all impact on the bearing's dB level. So that's why we need to take baselines for the dB. For the
Thank you. The second question that I see in the chat here is, hello, Andre, what is your view on the possibility to make the service life of greases longer by using ultrasound monitoring? So we've talked, of course, about bearings. So here we see a question about actually lengthening the life of the lubricant of the grease. How do you see that?
I'm not sure that ultrasound will have a big impact on the life of the lubricant, because the life of lubricant is dependent on the operational conditions of the bearing, I think, and it's also conditioned on the type of lubricant we use. I mean, some lubricants, not all lubricants are made the same. You find some lubricants will really last long. You can just look at the price of lubricants. You can have greases that cost you probably $2 a tube, and you can have greases cost you $500 a tube. So those things will have a far bigger impact on the life of the grease than ultrasound.
Do you have cooperations with other companies to, let's say, combine your solution and ultrasound together with other solutions that might help extend the life of lubricants or other maintenance solutions?
Absolutely. I mean, I would love to see. My understanding is that all companies are there to help the corporations or the big plants work at their best. And that's why I have no difficulty if somebody comes to me and says, here's some ultrasound, somebody else comes along and say, here's some vibration analysis, and we need to combine the two. I've done lots of work where I work with VA specialists or thermal specialists or lubricant analysis specialists, and together we put together a proposal for a company. And often I find, I mean, humans we can feel, we can hear, we can smell. The fact that you can feel doesn't mean you knock out your ears or cut out your eyes. We use all those senses together to work together. And that's why ultrasound and oil analysis and oil manufacturers all need to get together and work together to try and improve technology and work together to help the clients. Because at the end of the day, if you can come up with a package to help a client extend the life of the equipment, then you're in the pound seats. And my understanding is, I don't care who I work with, as long as the joint team
I
can
love
add
that
value.
statement, and I couldn't agree more. It all ties in with profitability, financial results, but also sustainability. I think there's a lot to be gained and a lot of money and increased efficiency that's left on the table at the moment. And hopefully in the future we see more cooperation.
One of the comments that the ultrasound company makes is they say people who start using ultrasound assisted greasing use about 30% less grease. Now, if we can cut out 30% unnecessary grease used in industry for sustainability, that'll be a really big impact.
Thank you very much, Andre. I think we have reached the end of our time slot. Super useful info. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing it live. Thank you also to the participants and attendees. Thank you for asking the questions. Hope you enjoy the rest of LRVS, and hope to see you next year as well, Andre. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody listening. Thank you. Bye.